They called her cursed, but a lone rancher saw his future in her eyes. The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted of judgment. It clung to the back of Ilara's throat, a gritty film of shame that no amount of swallowing could dislodge. It was the same dust that coated the boots of the silent, staring townsfolk, the same dust that powdered the black frock coat of Pastor Gideon as he raised a condemning hand toward her. The sun, a merciless hammer in the vast bleached sky, beat down on her uncovered head, her hair a tangled mess of sweat-soaked auburn strands. She stood on the raw timber steps of the church, the very place she had been married, the place she had prayed with a desperate, clawing hope that had curdled into this public nightmare. Her dress, a faded calico worn thin from worry and work, was stained, not with dirt, but with the ghost of a life that had refused to take root. The dark, damning gloom of her third lost child had been the final seal on her fate. It had happened. Yesterday, a silent, agonizing surrender in the cold privacy of her own bed. But secrets in Redemption Gulch had the lifespan of a mayfly. Her husband, Thomas, a man whose love had proven as shallow as a dry creek bed, had not held her. He had not whispered words of comfort. He had looked at her with a horror that was not for her loss, but for his own blighted reputation, and then he had gone straight to the pastor. Now she was a spectacle, a sermon made flesh. "Baron!" Pastor Gideon's voice boomed, a righteous thunder that echoed off the false fronts of the general store and the saloon. The word was a physical blow, and Ilara flinched, her gaze falling to her own hands, twisting the fabric of her skirt into knots. They were empty hands, always empty. The Lord plants a seed in fertile ground. He does not waste his bounty on rock and thistle. 3 times the Lord has offered this woman the sacred gift of life, and 3 times she has rejected it. Her womb is a tomb, a vessel of sin and curse. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The women who had once offered her tight-lipped smiles and traded recipes for corn bread now clutched their own children closer, their eyes a mixture of pity and fear. They looked at her as if she were a contagion, a walking omen of their own deepest anxieties. The men, faces hardened by the sun and the unforgiving land, stared with a colder curiosity, their expressions ranging from grim satisfaction to a sort of detached pity. She was a broken thing, and in the harsh calculus of the frontier, broken things were discarded. Her husband, a good God-fearing man, the pastor continued, gesturing to Thomas, who stood near the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of pious suffering, has borne this cross with patience. But no man is asked to lie with a curse. He has cast her out, as is his right, as is his duty. Cast out. The words hum in the shimmering heat. She had nowhere to go. Her family was 1,000 miles and a lifetime away, buried in the green hills of Ohio. Here there was only this dusty street, this circle of accusing eyes, and the endless, indifferent expanse of the plains beyond. Her gaze drifted past the faces, past the buildings, to the horizon, a wavering line of deep blue against the brassy sky. It looked like the edge of the world, a place to fall off. What is to become of her? A woman's voice, sharp and practical, cut through the preacher's rhetoric. Pastor Gideon's smile was thin, reptilian. The Lord provides. But the devil finds work for idle hands and empty souls. She cannot remain here, a blight upon our community, a reminder of God's judgment. He let the implication hang in. The air, thick and suffocating. A woman alone, cast out, had few paths, and none of them led to salvation. The brothel in dusty Abilene, a slow starvation in the wilderness. Or worse. Ilara felt a strange detachment, as if she were floating above her own body, watching this cruel theater unfold. The pain was so vast, so all-consuming, it had become a sort of numbness. The heat, the dust, the hateful words, they were happening to someone else, someone who still had something left to lose. She had nothing. The last of her hope had bled out of her yesterday, leaving only a hollow ache. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she allowed herself a final, desperate prayer. Not for rescue, not for mercy, but for the earth to simply open up and swallow her whole. Let the dust she tasted be her final blanket. Let the silence of the grave be her only peace. The crowd shifted. A ripple of movement, a collective intake of breath that was different from the murmurs before. It was a sound of surprise, of disbelief. Ilara's eyes fluttered open, drawn by the sudden change in the atmosphere. The circle of townsfolk had parted, creating a narrow aisle. And at the far end of it, a shadow took form. He was a man who seemed carved from the land itself, all harsh angles and sun-scorched stillness. He sat atop a dust-colored horse that stood as silent and patient as its rider. He wore no preacher's coat, no merchant's vest. Just worn denim, a leather vest that had seen 100 storms, and a hat pulled low, its brim casting his face in deep shadow. But even from this distance, Ilara could feel the weight of his gaze. It was not curious, not pitying, not cruel. It was still, as still and deep as a winter well. Silas Blackwood, the lone rancher, the man who lived miles out of town, on a spread of land people said was haunted by its own tragedies. He rarely came to Redemption Gulch, and when he did, he moved through it like a ghost, his transactions brief, his words few. People whispered about him. They said he'd lost his wife and child in a fire that had consumed his first homestead. They said the grief had hollowed him out, leaving nothing but a quiet, brooding intensity. He was a wound that had never healed, an outcast of his own making. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched, his presence a silent counterpoint to Pastor Gideon's noisy condemnation. The preacher, momentarily thrown off his rhythm, faltered. He glanced at the rider, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. This was his stage, his sermon. Silas Blackwood had no part in it. As I was saying, Gideon blustered, turning back to the crowd, his voice regaining its righteous fervor. This woman is now outside the grace of this community. She is outside the grace of God. He pointed a final triumphant finger at Ilara. She is cursed. The word, the final nail in her coffin, hung in the dead, hot air. Ilara's shoulders slumped. The numbness was receding, replaced by a cold, terrifying dread. This was it. The end. She would be driven out into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a brand on her soul. And then, a sound, the soft creak of leather, the clink of a spur. Silas Blackwood swung his leg over his horse, his boots landing in the dust with a soft thud. He didn't stride, he walked. A slow, deliberate pace that seemed to measure the silence between heartbeats. The crowd parted for him as if he were a force of nature, a boulder rolling downhill. He walked up the narrow aisle they had made, his gaze never leaving Ilara. He stopped at the bottom of the church steps, his shadow falling over her. He was taller than she'd realized, broad-shouldered and lean. He pushed the brim of his hat back with a thumb, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly. It was a landscape of its own, etched with lines of sun and sorrow. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths she saw not judgment, but a reflection of her own desolation. It was a look of profound soul-deep recognition. He was not looking at a curse. He was looking at a fellow survivor. Pastor Gideon stared, his mouth agape. "Mr. Blackwood, this is church business. It does not concern you." Silas's gaze didn't flicker. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the sharp edge of honed steel. It was rough, like stones grinding together, the sound of a voice long unused. "I'll take her." The words were not a question. They were a statement, as simple and solid as the earth beneath their feet. A wave of shock washed over the crowd. Thomas, her husband, took a half-step forward, his face a comical mask of confusion and outrage. "Take her? She's barren. She's no use to anyone. Silas finally turned his head, his stormy eyes fixing on Thomas. The look he gave him could have frozen fire. That's for me to decide. He turned back to Alara. The world had shrunk to the space between them, to the few feet of dusty timber that separated their broken lives. He held out a hand. It was not a soft hand. It was calloused and scarred, the hand of a man who wrestled a living from an unforgiving earth. It was a hand that knew work and pain and loss. It did not tremble. "The preacher's right about one thing," Silas said, his voice low, meant only for her. "A woman alone won't last the winter. My ranch, it needs a woman's touch. And I need a wife." It wasn't a proposal born of love or passion. It was a lifeline. A pact of survival offered in the face of shared damnation. He was not offering her salvation. He was offering her a chance. A chance to trade one form of desolation for another, perhaps. But it was a chance. Her heart, which she thought had turned to stone, gave a painful, stuttering beat. She looked. From his outstretched hand to his eyes, those deep, quiet pools of sorrow. She saw no pity there, only a stark, brutal honesty. He was not saving her. They were, perhaps, saving each other. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Ilara straightened her back. She lifted her chin, meeting the stunned, furious gaze of Pastor Gideon and the bewildered stare of the man who had been her husband. She did not look at them. She looked through them. Then, her gaze dropped back to the man before her. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her small, trembling hand into his large, steady one. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, solid warmth that seemed to anchor her to the world again. It was the first human touch she had felt in days that was. Not a push or a shove. It was not tender. It was not gentle. It was definite. Without another word, Silas Blackwood turned and led her down the steps, through the stunned, silent crowd that parted before them like the Red Sea. He did not look back, and neither did she. He lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing, settling her in front of him, and then swung up behind her. His body was a solid wall at her back, a shield against the stares and the whispers. As the horse turned, its hooves kicking up the dust of her old life, Ilara caught one last glimpse of Redemption Gulch. The faces were a blur of condemnation and confusion. She saw Thomas, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. She saw Pastor Gideon, his face purple with thwarted rage. They looked small, insignificant. Then Silas urged the horse into a steady trot, and they left the town behind, riding out into the vast, silent, and terrifying promise of the open plains. The sun was still a hammer, the land was still unforgiving. But for the first time in a long time, she was not alone in her curse. She was riding toward a new beginning, wrapped in the shadow of a man as broken as she was, his hand holding the reins, guiding them toward a future that was as uncertain and as vast as the sky above. The ride to his ranch was a journey through silence, the rhythmic plod of the horse's hooves, the creak of saddle leather, the sigh of the wind through the tall, dry grass. These were the only sounds that passed between them. Ilara sat stiffly, her back a rigid plank against Silas's chest. She was acutely aware of the heat of him, the solid, unyielding presence that was both a comfort and a terror. He had saved her from public ruin, but to what end? She was the property of a stranger, a man whose soul was as shuttered and barred as the windows of the abandoned homesteads they passed. His ranch was not a place of welcome. It was a testament to neglect born of grief. The main house, a sturdy log cabin, seemed to be sinking into the earth, its porch sagging like a weary sigh. The fences were a patchwork of old and new repairs, some sections leaning at drunken angles. A barn stood nearby, its great doors slightly ajar, revealing a darkness within. The only signs of life were a few hardy chickens scratching in the dirt and the distant, mournful lowing of cattle. The place felt as hollowed out as its owner. Silas dismounted and reached up for her. His hand spanned her waist, lifting her down with that same surprising, effortless strength. For a moment, her feet on the ground, she felt his hands linger. A brief, uncertain pressure before he let go and turned away. "The well is over there," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Water's clean. Houses, it is what it is." He led the horse toward the barn, leaving her alone in the dusty yard. Ilara stood frozen, a solitary figure in the immense, empty landscape. The silence here was different from the silence on the ride. It was deeper, heavier, weighted with the ghosts of what had been. She could almost hear the echo of a woman's laughter, the patter of a child's feet. The ghosts of his lost family. She, the barren woman, had been brought to a house haunted by a child. The irony was a fresh, sharp pain in her chest. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing sand, she walked to the house. The door creaked open under her touch. The inside was worse than she could have imagined. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, a fine gray shroud over a life interrupted. A rocking chair set by the cold hearth, a small hand-stitched blanket draped over its arm. On the mantelpiece, two figures had been traced in the dust, a large one and a small one, as if a child had been playing there just before the world ended. The air was stale, thick with the smell of disuse and sorrow. This was not a home, it was a tomb, and he had brought her here to be its new keeper. The first days were a silent, brutal negotiation of space and grief. They did not speak of what had happened in the town. They did not speak of his past or hers. They communicated through action, through necessity. Silas would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and efficient. He would leave a bucket of milk on the porch steps, still warm from the cow, and then disappear into the vastness of his land. Ilara, in turn, would begin the monumental task of reclaiming the house from its shroud of dust and sorrow. She scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees, the harsh lye soap biting at her skin, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the ache in her soul. She washed the windows, letting the stark, bright sunlight spill into the gloomy rooms for what felt like the first time in years. She beat the dust from the rugs, each slap a blow against her own despair. She was not just cleaning a house. She was fighting for a foothold, a reason to draw her next breath. One afternoon, while clearing the hearth, her fingers brushed against something hard beneath the accumulated ash. She dug it out. It was a small, carved wooden horse, its paint faded, one leg broken, a child's toy. She held it in her palm. The smooth, worn wood a phantom weight. A wave of such profound, suffocating grief washed over her for the child this man had lost, for the children she had lost, for the crushing emptiness of her own body, that her knees gave way. She sank to the floor, the wooden horse clutched in her hand, and for the first time since the day of her public shaming, she wept. Not loud, racking sobs, but a silent, desperate leaking of all the pain she had held inside. The sound of boots on the porch made her freeze. Silas was back early. She scrambled to her feet, hastily wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to shove the toy into her apron pocket. But it was too late. He stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking the light, his face unreadable in the shadows. His gaze dropped to her hand, still clutching the broken horse. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. She expected anger, a harsh word for disturbing the relics of his past. Instead, he just looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to understanding. He walked past her to the fireplace, took the toy from her unresisting fingers, and gently placed it back on the mantelpiece, propping it up so it wouldn't fall. He didn't say a word. He just turned and left the house, leaving her trembling in the newly cleaned room. That evening, when she went to the porch, she found not only the bucket of milk, but also a string of freshly caught fish, their scales still shimmering. It was a clumsy offering, a silent apology, a fragile truce. And so they began to build a life not on words, but on small unspoken gestures. She learned the rhythm of his days, the way he liked his coffee black and strong, the weary slump of his shoulders when he came in after a long day of mending fences. He, in turn, began to notice the changes in the house. The smell of baking, bread that now greeted him at the door, the clean, patched curtains on the windows, the small jar of wildflowers she placed on the table. One day, he found her struggling to chop wood, the heavy axe unwieldy in her hands. He came up behind her, his large hands closing over hers on the handle. "Like this," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He guided her through the motion, his body a warm, solid presence. The axe swung true, splitting the log with a satisfying crack. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. It was the closest they had been, a moment of shared effort that was more intimate than any conversation. But trust was a wild, skittish thing. There were days when the silence between them felt like a chasm, when the weight of their unspoken griefs was too heavy to bear. She would see him staring out at the horizon, his face a mask of such profound loss that it stole her breath. And he would sometimes catch her standing by the window, her hands unconsciously cradling her flat stomach, her eyes filled with a desolation he knew all too well. On those days, they would retreat into their separate shells, the fragile bridge between them washed away by a fresh tide of pain. They nearly gave up a dozen times. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of chasing a stray calf, they sat at the table, the silence thick with exhaustion and frustration. Alara, her hands raw and her body aching, looked at this grim, silent man in the bleak, empty house. And a wave of despair washed over her. "Why did you do it?" she whispered, the words tearing from her throat. "Why did you take me?" Silas looked up from his plate, his eyes dark. He was silent for a long moment, and she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "Because I know what it is to be judged," he said, "and I know what it is to be alone." He looked down at his scarred hands. "I saw the way they looked at you, like you were already dead. I couldn't leave you to them." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was a confession of shared humanity. And in that moment, something shifted. The chasm between them didn't disappear, but it seemed a little less wide, a little less deep. They were two broken souls, yes, but they were facing the darkness together. The first trip back to Redemption Gulch was a trial by fire. They needed supplies: flour, salt, seeds for a small garden Alara was determined to plant. As their wagon rattled down the main street, Alara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. The whispers started immediately, a venomous hiss that followed them like a swarm of angry bees. "There she is, the cursed one. Look at her, sitting up there like she's a queen. Blackwood's a fool. That woman will bring him nothing but ruin." Alara kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap, her back ramrod straight. But she could feel the heat of the stairs, the sting of the judgment. It was the church steps all over again. Inside the general store, the air grew thick with hostility. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man with a perpetually sour face, looked past Alara as if she were invisible, addressing only Silas. "What can I get for you, Blackwood?" "We need flour," Silas said, his voice calm and even, "and salt, and a packet of carrot seeds." Henderson began to measure out the flour, his movements deliberately slow. A woman at the counter, Mrs. Gable, the town's most notorious gossip, turned and gave Alara a look of pure malice. "I hear your new wife is fixing up the old place, Silas, trying to play house. But you can't make a home out of a cursed womb." Alara flinched as if struck. The bag of flour in Henderson's hand suddenly slipped, spilling a white cloud onto the floor at Alara's feet. "Clumsy woman!" Henderson snapped, glaring at her. "Look what you made me do. You'll pay for that." It was a blatant lie, a deliberate act of cruelty. Alara opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. The shame, the injustice of it all, choked her. But before she could shrink away, Silas moved. He stepped in front of her, placing himself between her and the storekeeper. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence was enough. "She didn't touch it, Henderson," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You dropped it. Now you'll sweep it up, and you'll give us a fresh bag. And you will put it on my account." Henderson's face paled. He looked from Silas's stony expression to the other customers, who were watching with rapt attention. He had expected the rancher to be cowed, to be ashamed of the woman he'd taken in. He had not expected this quiet, unyielding defense. "And another thing," Silas continued, his stormy eyes scanning the room, meeting the gaze of Mrs. Gable and the others. "This is my wife. Her name is Alara Blackwood. When you speak to her, you will use her name. And you will show her the respect due to any other woman in this town. Is that understood?" The silence in the store was absolute. Mrs. Gable's mouth snapped shut. Henderson, his face mottled with anger and humiliation, grabbed a broom and began to sweep up the spilled flour. He did not meet Silas's eyes. As they left the store, their supplies in hand, the whispers that followed them were different. They were still laced with resentment, but now there was a new note of grudging respect. Silas Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with, and he had drawn his line in the dust. His wife, the cursed woman, was under his protection. Not everyone was hostile. As they were loading the wagon, an old woman with skin like wrinkled leather and eyes as dark and bright as obsidian approached them. She was Maria, a native woman who lived on the edge of town, a purveyor of herbs and folk wisdom, another soul on the fringes of redemption's grace. She ignored Silas and spoke directly to Alara, her voice soft. "The earth is not cursed," she said, pressing a small cloth bundle into Alara's hand. "Sometimes it is just resting, waiting for the right season." Alara opened the bundle. Inside was a collection of dried leaves and roots. "For tea," Maria said with a small knowing smile. "To make the body strong. To quiet the soul." It was a small act of kindness, of solidarity, but it felt monumental. It was a crack of light in the suffocating darkness of the town's judgment. As they rode away from Redemption Gulch, Alara held the small bundle in her lap, the scent of the dried herbs of fragrant promise. The whispers were turning, not yet to respect, but from condemnation to a grudging curiosity. They had stood their ground, and they had not broken. The seasons turned. The fragile garden Alara had planted took root, its green shoots a defiant splash of life against the hard, dry earth. The house, once a tomb, began to feel like a home. The scent of baking bread replaced the smell of dust. The sound of Alara's humming as she worked became a quiet counterpoint to the sigh of the wind. And the silence between them, once a chasm of pain, became a comfortable space, filled with unspoken understanding. They had built a life, a fragile, hard-won peace. But the frontier was a fickle partner, and it was about to demand its final terrible price. The sky had been a strange bruised yellow all day. The air was thick, heavy and hot, carrying the distant, acrid smell of smoke. A fire, miles away, but the wind was shifting, blowing from the north, pushing the unseen threat closer. Silas stood on the porch, his face grim as he scanned the horizon, a dark, angry smudge against the sickly sky. "It's moving fast," he said, his voice tight. "Faster than I've ever seen." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the quiet warmth Alara had come to cherish. She came to stand beside him, her hand instinctively going to his arm. "What do?" "We do? We fight," he said, his jaw set. We get the cattle into the far pasture, near the creek. It's the lowest ground. Might be safe there. Then we wet down the house and the barn. Pray the wind changes." There was no time for debate. No time for fear. They moved with a desperate, synchronized urgency that was born of months of working side by side. They were a team now, their movements fluid, their thoughts aligned. He rode out to herd the terrified cattle, his shouts swallowed by the rising wind, while Alara worked the pump, her arms aching as she filled bucket after bucket of water. The sky grew darker, the sun a dim, orange disk behind a veil of smoke. The air grew thick with ash, a gray snow that coated everything. The smell of burning pine was overpowering. Ilara hauled the heavy buckets, sloshing water against the dry logs of the cabin, against the roof of the barn, her lungs burning with every breath. The heat was immense, a physical presence that seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. Silas returned, his face black with soot, his eyes red-rimmed. "Wild. They're in the pasture," he yelled over the roar of the wind and the distant, terrifying crackle of the approaching flames. "Now we save the house." They worked together, a frantic, desperate ballet against the apocalypse. They beat at the small embers that landed on the roof with wet sacks, their arms screaming with effort. The fire was no longer a distant threat. It was here. A wall of roaring, consuming flame was racing across the prairie, devouring everything in its path. It was a monster of unimaginable fury. A burning branch, carried by the wind, landed on the barn roof. It smoldered for a second, then burst into flame. The barn! Alara screamed. Silas didn't hesitate. He grabbed a ladder, propped it against the burning structure, and started to climb, a wet sack in his hand. "Keep wetting the house," he yelled. "Don't stop." She watched in horror as he climbed toward the flames, a solitary figure against a backdrop of hell. The wind whipped the fire into a frenzy, and for a moment, he was completely engulfed in smoke and flame. Her heart stopped. A primal scream tore from her throat. "Silas!" He emerged from the smoke, beating at the flames on the roof, but it was a losing battle. The old, dry timber of the barn was catching fast. The fire was spreading. "It's no good," he shouted, his voice raw. "Get back to the house. Get the blankets. Wet them down." He scrambled down the ladder just as a section of the roof collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the sky. One of them, a glowing red demon, landed on the hem of Alara's dress. In an instant, the tunka, dry calico, was alight. She screamed, batting at the flames with her hands, but it only seemed to make them leap higher. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her, and then he was there. He tackled her, throwing her to the ground and rolling her in. The dust, his own body covering hers, smothering the flames. For a moment, they lay there, gasping for air, the roar of the fire all around them. His weight was on her, his face inches from hers. His eyes, wild and terrified, stared into hers. And in that moment, in the heart of the inferno, the last of their walls crumbled to ash. "Ilara," he gasped, his voice thick with a desperate, ragged emotion she had never heard from him before. I thought I'd lost you." All the unspoken words, all the shared grief, all the clumsy, tender gestures of the past months culminated in that one raw confession. He was not just fighting for his ranch. He was fighting for her. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the soot and the grime. "You came back for me," she whispered, her hand coming up to cup his soot-stained cheek. "I'll always come back for you," he said, his voice breaking. The fire didn't matter. The barn didn't matter. Nothing mattered but this raw, terrifying, beautiful truth that had been forged between them in the heart of the flames. But the fire was not done with them. The wind shifted again, a great, howling gust that pushed the main wall of flame directly toward the house. "We have to go," he said, pulling her to her feet. "The creek. It's our only chance." He grabbed her hand, and they ran. They ran from the burning barn, from the house they had so painstakingly rebuilt, from the life they had just begun to find. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke a suffocating blanket. They stumbled through the yard, past the garden now withered by the heat, and toward the relative safety of the pasture. They reached the creek bed just as the fire swept over their homestead. They plunged into the shallow, muddy water, pulling a wet blanket over their heads as the world around them exploded in a roar of flame. Elora clung to Silas, her face buried in his chest, as the firestorm passed over them. It was the end of the world, a symphony of destruction. She could feel the violent tremor of his heart against her cheek, the protective circle of his arms a last desperate anchor in the chaos. And then, as quickly as it had come, the roar began to recede, replaced by the crackle and hiss of cooling embers. Slowly, cautiously, Silas lifted the blanket. The world was gone. Where their home had stood, there's only a smoking, blackened ruin. The barn was a skeleton of charred timbers. The fences were gone. The garden was ash. Everything was gone. Everything they had built together, wiped from the earth. A sob of pure despair escaped Elara's lips. It was over. They had lost. Silas pulled her closer, his arms tightening around her. He said nothing. He just held her as she wept, his own silent tears tracing clean paths through the soot on his face. They stood there for a long time, two solitary figures in a landscape of utter devastation, clinging to each other, the only two things left standing. The sun rose the next morning on a world of black and gray. The fire had passed, leaving behind a scarred, wounded land that steamed in the cool morning air. Their house was a pile of smoldering rubble. The barn was a ghostly silhouette of charred beams. It was a scene of absolute annihilation, but they were alive. They walked through the ruins, their feet crunching on the ash-covered ground. Elara's heart was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Every familiar object, the rocking chair, the table where they had shared their silent meals, the small jar she had kept filled with wildflowers was gone, reduced to unrecognizable heaps of charcoal and ash. She stopped where the hearth had been and saw something in the debris. She bent down and picked it up. It was the small carved wooden horse. It was blackened and charred, but it had survived. She clutched it in her hand, the small, resilient object, a symbol of something she couldn't yet name. Silas came to stand beside her. He looked at the ruin of their home, at the vast, empty expanse of his land, and then he looked at her. His face was streaked with soot and grief, but his eyes were clear. "I lost it all once before," he said, his voice low and raspy. "The house, the barn, my wife, my son." He finally said the words, giving voice to the ghost that had haunted him for so long. "I thought I could never build again. I thought there was nothing left to build with." He reached out and gently took the charred horse from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "But I was wrong." He looked from the toy to her face, his stormy eyes filled with a quiet, powerful conviction. "A home isn't timber and nails, Elara. I see that now. It's this." He didn't need to say more. It was in the way he looked at her, in the way his hand found hers, his fingers lacing through her own. It was in the shared devastation, the shared survival. They had lost everything, but they still had each other. And that, they were beginning to realize, was everything. In the days that followed, a strange thing happened. A wagon appeared on the horizon. It was Mr. Henderson from the general store. He didn't say much. He just unloaded a pile of lumber, a bag of nails, and a crate of tinned goods. "On your account, Blackwood," he mumbled, not quite meeting their eyes before turning his wagon and leaving. The next day, another wagon came, this one carrying a half-dozen men from town. They carried hammers and saws. They did not offer words of pity or condolence. They just started to work, clearing the debris, laying the foundations for a new house. Mrs. Gable arrived later, her face set in a grim, determined line. She pressed a basket into Alara's hands. It was filled with bread, cheese, and a freshly baked apple pie. "A body's got to eat," she said gruffly, and then she too picked up a shovel and began to help. The community, which had once cast Alara out, had come to stand with them. They had witnessed the fire. They had heard the stories of how the Blackwoods had fought, how they had stood together. They had seen something in that shared struggle that was stronger than any curse. They had seen family. They rebuilt the house, not as it was, but new. Stronger. The men worked on the structure, their hammers ringing out in the quiet air, a sound of creation, not destruction. The women, led by Alara, cooked for the work crew, their quiet chatter and shared labor weaving a new kind of community, one forged in the ashes of the old. Maria came too, her hands skilled at dressing the burns on Silas's arms, her quiet presence a balm to their weary souls. One evening, as the sun set, casting long golden rays over the healing land, the frame of the new house stood stark against the sky. It was a skeleton, a promise. Silas and Alara stood together, watching the men pack up their tools for the day. He turned to her, his hand finding hers. "They called you cursed," he said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. "But they were wrong. You're not a curse, Alara. You're a blessing. You brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life." She looked up at him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. The pain of her past, the sting of the judgment, the grief of her lost children, it was all still there. A part of her story, etched into her soul. But it was no longer the whole story. A few weeks later, under the vast, open sky, with the frame of their new home as their chapel and the entire community of Redemption Gulch as their witness, Pastor Gideon was conspicuously absent. In his place stood Maria, her face serene. It wasn't a traditional wedding. There were no rings, no fancy clothes. It was something deeper, a reaffirmation, a celebration of survival. Silas stood before Alara, his hands holding both of hers. He wore his clean work clothes, his face scrubbed, his eyes clear and fixed on her. She wore a simple dress, a gift from the women of the town, her hair braided with the wildflowers that were already beginning to push their way through the ash-covered soil. "We were two broken halves," Silas said, his voice steady and strong. "For all to hear. Alone we were just lost, but together." He smiled, a true, genuine smile that transformed his sorrow-etched face. "Together we are whole." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of quiet, profound tenderness. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and dust, of sorrow and survival, of a love that had not been sought, but had been forged in the heart of a fire. The crowd did not cheer. They stood in a respectful, humbled silence. They were witnessing something sacred. Not the joining of a man and a woman, but the redemption of a community, the birth of a family. Not of blood, but of choice. That night, in the half-built house, with the stars shining through the open rafters like 1,000 candles, they lay together on a simple mattress on the floor. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of fresh-cut pine and the promise of rain. Alara lay with her head on Silas's chest, her hand resting over his heart, feeling its slow, steady beat. The scars of their past were still there, on their bodies and on their souls, but they were no longer wounds. They were the proof that they had lived, that they had fought, that they had survived. They were the map of the long, hard road that had finally brought them home. She thought of the whispers that had once followed her, the cruel brand that had been seared onto her spirit. Cursed, barren, broken, they were just words. They had no power here, in the shelter of this man's arms, in the quiet peace of this new beginning. She was not empty. She was full, full of a strength she had never known she possessed, and a love she had never dared to dream of. They were broken, and now they were whole. And in the vast, silent heart of the American frontier, that was the only miracle that had ever truly mattered.